Good morning, dear friends. My name is Igor Yakovenko. It is now 7 hours 44 minutes in Kiev. It is currently today, February the 24th. It's clear what the date is, and we continue our morning reflections on what is happening in Russia, in the world, and in our souls. Well, I'll start with in light of the current global events unfolding today, among which perhaps the most significant and noteworthy can be considered the recent breaking report that has emerged, the Financial Times has officially reported that the nations of Iran and Russia have successfully negotiated and finalized a secret strategic deal valued at approximately 500 million euros. According to the specific terms of this agreement, the government in Moscow now formally undertakes the responsibility to supply this particular shipment of goods. Theocratic regime, including 500 advanced portable missile systems, specifically the 9K333 Verba, plus 1,500 individual missiles designed for them, and also an extensive and diverse array of other military equipment. So, the primary goal for Iran is to fully restore its entire system, which was severely damaged and compromised during the 12-day war. So, it is actually quite strange to mention that this is a secret deal. I mean, I don't really know of the existence of any public deals for the sale of weapons anywhere in the world, so it feels a bit redundant to even point that out. All of this is happening on the eve of a planned strike by the United States of America against Iran. Two massive carrier groups have already been successfully deployed over there. However, for now, Trump remains at a standstill. He stands there with his fist raised high, metaphorically speaking, ready to strike. However, there hasn't actually been a physical strike for a couple of months now. This is because, in reality, this whole story first began with Donald Trump's explicit promise and his direct call to the gathered protesters, urging them to go and seize the administrative buildings because help was already on the way to support them. Well, that particular event actually happened right at the very beginning of January, and now, as we can see, we're already at the end of February, and yet, despite all the talk, the help is still supposedly on the way. So, regarding the various forecasts and predictions about this deal, it made, according to information that was reported by the Financial Times, it made quite a strong and notable impression on, but frankly speaking, I can hardly imagine or picture what real tangible significance or impact this could actually have in practice. Because the Russian Federation's intervention in the event of, or any real assistance to Iran in the event of an attack by the United States of America government, I think this is one of those rare cases where I would allow myself to say it is a very bold and confident prediction. In this scenario, Russia will likely behave in roughly the same manner it did with regard to its involvement in Syria. That is to say, at the very most, Russia might receive Ayatollah Ali Khamenei somewhere in the city of Rostov or within the Moscow region as a symbolic gesture. This situation would be much the same as what occurred with its ally Venezuela. In other words, when the crisis hits, Russia will not even have the time to evacuate its allies. That is, it is 100% certain that the Putin fascist regime in this case will act in the same manner as any other typical regime, or to put it more bluntly, like a traitor. In fact, there are even notable examples regarding Iran, because there was that very specific 12-day war, and yet Russia did not offer assistance to Iran in any way. The one and only thing you can reliably depend upon is that Russia will not help the United States of America to overthrow the Iranian regime. But it seems that Trump isn't even setting that as a goal. That is to say, many observers also point back to the joint military exercises between Russia and Iran. But I would not take those maneuvers very seriously either, because the exercises were, well, it all looked very much like a choreographed show, primarily because only a handful of naval vessels actually went out to sea. Dating back from the last or even the previous century. Well, in general, and to put it quite simply, I think all of this should be regarded as, well, basically, it is very much like how Russia helped Syria, specifically the Syrian regime, and just like Russia helped the Venezuelan regime, which is to say, in other words, not at all. So I think this information from the Financial Times, to be perfectly honest with you, isn't really worth very much at all. Well, it's just that there have been a vast number of comments being shared about this situation lately, and many of them are filled with a great deal of anxiety. But I personally believe it is simply not worth paying any real attention to that noise. Now, as we turn our focus toward the main event of the day, today marks exactly 4 years since the start of the big war, that large scale war that erupted right in the heart of Europe. We've already begun. This discussion, we've talked about it with Mikhail Valentinovich Sava, with a few other people, with Andrei Andreevich Piontkovsky. We'll have several more discussions. I want to say right away that we have a very comprehensive and extensive program planned to discuss this topic because it's a truly massive subject matter. It's a significant and complex question, so to speak. How these 4 years of war have changed the world. Today I'll share some very preliminary thesis-like initial observations about this, but there's a much larger conversation certainly ahead. And then we'll try to sum things up because this is, honestly speaking, truly the most important event of the 21st century. What is happening right now? And it's a fundamental change in all aspects of life. Well, I'll start with the ways this war has changed, not just Europe, I would say. There is a separate conversation to be had about the changes across Europe, but let's talk about how this war has deeply affected the policies of the EU leadership. And I would like for us to take a look at this picture right now of what the various European institutions actually look like at the current moment. This is what they look like. All of these various European institutions are decorated like this today in Ukrainian colors. So, Ursula von der Leyen, the European Commission president, made a very significant comment about this. She stated that this is a powerful sign of unity and solidarity, and she also announced that today we are proudly decorating our European institutions with the vibrant colors of Ukraine. These two colors, blue and yellow, truly embody the spirit of courage and burning resistance. And she concluded her heartfelt message on various social media platforms with the powerful words, "Glory to Ukraine." In fact, throughout all 4 years of this devastating Great War, all of the major European Union buildings have regularly and brightly illuminated their institutions in the symbolic blue and yellow colors of the Ukrainian flag. This happens constantly. Of course, I understand that this might provoke some irony, that it would be better if they gave more missiles, more money, but in this case, a political gesture is also very important. Now let's actually try to discuss how people are reacting to this date. I've already initiated this conversation about how Europe is responding to these developments. So, I searched extensively but unsuccessfully to find any signs of a planned speech by Putin on this particular occasion. I actually didn't find any at all. Yesterday, there was quite a significant amount. Putin, as they say, far exceeded the original plan for his public appearances, which included a major keynote speech about February 23rd. Well, it was the usual routine speech. And he met personally with the grieving widows of the fallen occupiers. There were also a significant number of other commemorative events dedicated specifically to the holiday on February 23rd. Right now, I have a somewhat uncertain and not very confident prediction that Vladimir Putin will not say anything at all regarding the fourth anniversary of the big war. The reason is clear. What is there to talk about when there's nothing to say? To talk about the fact that this war, which has been ongoing for 4 years now, is something that we really need to discuss. So far, it hasn't brought any real successes except for capturing a few small settlements in Ukraine, which have been left as barren, scorched earth. It is almost as if to say, since this conflict is constantly being compared to the scale of World War II, that instead of taking a city like Berlin, they took Avdiivka instead. They want to show the completely destroyed ruins of Avdiivka as a major victory, the result of 4 years of the big war. At the same time, total military combat losses amounted to approximately 1,500,000 Russian occupying forces. But that is not exactly the kind of image that Putin wants to project in such cases. When Putin has absolutely nothing to say, he retreats into the shadows, hides himself away under a protective cover, and disappears from the radar. I think that this time the same thing will happen. Regarding the 4 years of the big war, he most likely won't say anything at all. I could be wrong, but at least that's my prediction. I think that on this notable and important occasion, there will be a major and significant address delivered by both the military as well as the political leadership of Russia, or rather, I should say, of Ukraine, of course. Russia, on the other hand, will remain silent because here, Ukraine has something to say. It seems to me that in order to truly understand the profound changes that have happened to Ukraine, to Russia, and to the whole of Europe during this difficult time, you just need to look back and remember exactly what it was like. That is to say, on the early morning of February 24th at 3:50 a.m., the Russian Federation officially began this full-scale military invasion, changing the course of history forever. A full-scale military invasion. The invasion came from 9 different geographical directions. That means coordinated strikes were carried out. Russian troops simultaneously crossed Ukraine's state border from several directions, specifically from 9 directions, including from the territory of Belarus. And at the same time, a series of massive and devastating missile strikes were launched across the country. Now that we have finished discussing these points, let us move on and begin shifting our focus away from these individual specifics. A small but important detail to note is that it was already late at night across Russia and Ukraine, but still the middle of the day over in Washington, D.C., and this full-scale invasion actually started to unfold literally right at the same time as the meeting was happening. During a formal meeting of the UN Security Council, which at that specific time was being chaired by Russia. So, you see, if we really sit down to talk about exactly how the entire global world order was systematically destroyed during those 4 long years of war, then let's just pause for a second and take note of this very fact. The nation responsible for the aggression is currently chairing the UN Security Council, and simultaneously, news comes in that a full-scale attack has been launched against a major European country. And so, you see, I think it's absolutely crucial at this particular point to reconstruct exactly what was taking place in the UN meeting room at that moment. Well, this is known now. Both Ukrainian and international global media outlets are extensively reporting on the specific details of how the intense dialogue unfolded at that critical moment between the Ukrainian and Russian delegations. This occurred when Nebenzia was pointedly asked, well, why don't you just pick up the phone and call President Putin or call Foreign Minister Lavrov right now? So, essentially, we must ask ourselves what is truly happening on the ground during these negotiations. Let's see, right now the UN Security Council meeting is underway. During the session, Vasily Nebenzia uttered some truly astonishing words when he claimed that he would not wake anyone up. By saying this, he essentially implied that Vladimir Putin and Sergei Lavrov were both peacefully sleeping like innocent babies in their beds, even as the Russian military continues its relentless bombing of Ukrainian cities and attempts to occupy the capital city of Kiev. It's extremely revealing that nearly the entire vast majority The world's civilized nations and the major intelligence services of the United States of America were absolutely certain that Ukraine would be defeated literally in the first few days, or perhaps weeks, or at the very latest, within a couple of months after the full scale war began. But something completely different happened. That is to say, from the very beginning, the entire professional Russian army was destroyed. And already by the spring of 2022, the armed forces of Ukraine successfully forced the Russian army to retreat from the Kiev, Chernihiv, and Sumy regions. This was a truly significant achievement for the nation. What is also extremely important to note is that after these regions were liberated, the entire world learned about the monstrous mass war crimes committed by Russian forces against the innocent civilian population in Bucha, Irpin, and many other cities. Then, later in the autumn of 2022, Ukrainian military forces successfully carried out a series of major counteroffensive operations across both the east and the south. Consequently, the strategic city of Kherson, which had been occupied during the very first days of the conflict, was successfully liberated, as was nearly the entire surrounding territory of the Kharkiv region. And furthermore, it is important to note that this fundamentally changed the overall attitude toward the war, including on the part of Europe. In other words, it became clear that Ukraine was not losing, that Ukraine could and should be helped. Following those events, the conflict transitioned into a much more grueling and difficult positional phase that persisted throughout the years of 2023, 2024, and into 2025. And since the Russian military was ultimately unable to achieve a decisive victory on the open battlefield, it instead resorted to a campaign of terror, manifesting in various brutal forms against the population. Attempts to commit genocide against the civilian population. Well, the most recent special event. It's the recent Flamingo missile strike successfully targeted and hit a strategic military manufacturing factory located deep within the region of Udmurtia. And right now I'm really trying, so to speak, to follow the instructions. Military experts advise not to say offensive or counter-offensive actions as a result of which territory was liberated. According to various sources, somewhere between 300 and 400 square kilometers of Ukrainian territory were liberated as it has been described. That is the chronology, and at the same time, this significant event took place. I would call it a fascist coup in the United States of America when the administration led by Donald Trump came to power. This led to drastic changes in the situation regarding international support for Ukraine. It was reduced by half because previously both Europe and the US were providing assistance, but now only Europe is helping. Donald Trump's rise to the presidency significantly exacerbated the situation regarding international support. But nevertheless, it clearly demonstrated that the level of Europe's strategic agency has increased. As a direct result of this conflict, Europe has finally begun to develop and acquire its military political agency, DOK. This represents yet another change brought about by 4 years of war. Europe began to. They aim to restore and revitalize that very same military political agency it once possessed before the outbreak of World War II. Well, I think it's worth discussing this, isn't it? To talk about it in more detail, but nevertheless, what else has happened? There has been a fundamental change in perceptions of the war itself. That is, I think this war is unlike any other conflict we have seen, especially compared to what happened before. It is a war that stands alone. In the modern era, traditional types of military assets matter significantly less now. Conventional weapons, all these incredibly expensive warships and costly types of weaponry, so to speak, have changed. ballistic missiles, and the entire nuclear triad, all of that has suddenly lost much of its former strategic significance. This is because one of the most striking examples of this shift can be seen in the changing role of the Navy. The Russian Black Sea Fleet, it was quite a serious, formidable, and highly independent combat unit. It was truly a massive naval fleet, widely recognized as one of the primary main fleets of the entire Russian Federation, which has now been essentially destroyed and driven back. It is currently hiding, so to speak, within the various secure ports located all along the Caucasian Black Sea coast, specifically the Russian ones. This truly incredible military feat was accomplished entirely by the nation of Ukraine, a country which, in actual point of fact, did not even possess a functional or traditional navy of its own at the time. Well, I mean, there were some individual tugboats and ships, but that was really about it. Nothing resembling, it wasn't even called that. Ukraine did not actually possess a fleet in the Black Sea. It was not even referred to by that name. Remarkably, this was accomplished by using rather inexpensive naval drones. So, this is a very fundamental concept. And here it's the same what's happening, what has exactly happened recently. The Flamingo strike on this, this highly significant and most important strategic plant clearly demonstrates that there is a formidable and robust Russian military industry, truly powerful. Indeed, there are a lot of them. The same Udmurtia is filled with military factories. There is a large industrial concern in the nearby area. In addition to this most important strategic location, the plant, the Votkinsk military plant, where Iskanders are produced, where Oreshniks are produced. In other words, a significant part of the nuclear triad is actually manufactured there. In addition, the Kalashnikov concern is situated in the immediate vicinity. So Udmurtia, a region positioned deep in the heart of Russia, is heavily oversaturated with military production facilities. And then suddenly it turned out that it reaches that there is a threat of strikes from Ukraine. This has also radically changed the whole situation because it became clear that these incredibly expensive military plants turned out to be vulnerable. In other words, the entire understanding of modern warfare is fundamentally changing. That is to say, successfully serving as a substitute for the extraordinarily expensive, highly sophisticated, and high precision weaponry, which previously served as the very core foundation. Back when the Russian army was widely regarded as the second army in the world, it wasn't a caricatured or exaggerated statement, it was actually a serious assessment. Analysis of the military technical arsenals of different countries. This wasn't a Russian conclusion. It wasn't Russian propaganda, Solovyov's. It was the conclusion of a number of research institutes that compared the military technical potential of different countries. In terms of this potential, even if we consider only conventional weapons and not the nuclear triad, where generally speaking one could talk about some kind of parity with the United States of America, Russia really did rank highly. To be more precise, Russia was once positioned at the very forefront here. It held a solid second place, and specifically in terms of its conventional weapons, it was widely regarded as the second most powerful army in the world. It has now turned out that this ranking means nothing at all, absolutely nothing, because we see the Black Sea Fleet being systematically destroyed by relatively cheap drones, even during the execution of a major strategic operation, the so-called Operation Oreshnik. For God's sake, please excuse me. But during the execution of Operation Web, we are seeing Russian strategic bombers being systematically destroyed in an absolutely incredible and unprecedented way, specifically by utilizing ordinary trucks carrying specialized drones. So it effectively turns out that with these relatively very cheap mass-produced weapons, well, and the exact same logic goes for the Flamingo system as well, which is another remarkably cheap weapon. These massive, expensive aircraft are being destroyed by simple tools. They are being depleted incredibly. Consider the case of highly expensive weapon systems. So, what's the point, for example, if we take the United States of America as a primary example? What's the point of building these massive and incredibly expensive aircraft carriers if they can be easily destroyed by cheap drones? That is to say, this represents a significant and complex challenge, including for the North Atlantic Alliance, because the entire strategic military and political doctrine of NATO is essentially built around these incredibly expensive and sophisticated weapon systems. So it is increasingly clear that this development fundamentally and radically transforms the whole concept of modern warfare. The war in Ukraine clearly shows that it really doesn't make much of a significant difference how many aircraft carriers you have. Submarines, cruisers, and so on. And here you have the nation of Ukraine, which doesn't have a significant navy at all, yet it's capable of systematically destroying all of this military hardware. And really, the question is who actually controls the waters of the Black Sea at this very moment? It seems that Turkey does, and Ukraine as well, at least partially, with its naval drones. So, back in the days when it was frequently said that during the long years of the Cold War, there was a confrontation between two superpowers, and this confrontation was significantly determined by the balance of their economies. Today, it's not quite like that. Low cost, mass produced attrition weaponry is now able to effectively counter sophisticated and expensive precision guided systems. So, absolutely everything is constantly evolving here. That's exactly why the role of mobilization is changing. Right now, there's a lot of talk about Putin preparing for mobilization. I'm not so sure. I'm also not sure because the total number of people positioned at the very front, considered entirely by itself. The presence of a large amount of cannon fodder suddenly turns out to matter very little. Because if a full 90% of enemy destruction is accomplished by drones, and drones are, quite frankly, a relatively inexpensive and cost-effective weapon, and excuse me, you can easily manufacture enough drones for 1 million enemies. So in reality, it is no longer simply the sheer amount of cannon fodder that matters most, but rather the overall quality and skill of the army. So that's why, I don't know, is that the case? If people in Russia actually understand this, and in Russia they've learned to understand and to learn, then I doubt there's any point in carrying out a mobilization. That is, if we talk about what has happened in Russia during this time, over these 4 years, it is above all the crystallization of a fascist Reich. In Russia, quite literally and completely, that is, Putin, by starting this massive full-scale invasion on February 24th, 2022, he effectively signed a final death sentence for the Russian Empire. In other words, there is simply no turning back now. Vladimir Putin is completely incapable of ending this war because of these truly gigantic volumes of poisonous paste that he has squeezed out onto Russia, turning it into a country for which the state of perpetual warfare has become a primary way of existence. Now, so to speak, it is simply impossible to go back. It is impossible to force this paste back into the tube. That is to say, Vladimir Putin can no longer bring an end to this ongoing war. This is firstly because he simply does not want to, as war has now become the very meaning of his entire life. And secondly, it is that it is completely and utterly unclear what he would actually do with the nation of Russia in a situation without active conflict. What exactly is he going to do with this massive army and with this million ghouls, especially since the Russian military has fundamentally and drastically changed? The professional army was destroyed in the first months of the war. Then the entire army of young children was completely destroyed. That is to say, the massive army of inexperienced conscripts. And now the Russian army consists of two parts. Mercenaries who do not care at all whom or how to kill or where to kill, as long as they're handsomely paid. and hardened convicts who,